I want you to imagine a dilemma. I want to hear what you think should be done about it. This is imaginary. Let's imagine that I live in an apartment with a roommate, and we share a car. And this is 20 years ago, before cell phones. And here's what we do. We have irregular schedules, and it's hard for us to communicate with one another. There's a little box in which the keys are. If you come home and you see the keys in the box, you take the car. If the keys aren't in the box, you don't take the car. And we both realize that sometimes we're disappointed, but that's the way we organize how we use the car. So, I have promised a friend of mine that I'm going to drive him to the laundromat with his laundry at 3 o'clock. I come home at 2:45. The keys are in the box. So I take the keys and I make my preparations. As I'm about to walk out the door, I notice that my roommate has his date book open on the table, and in it is written, 3:15, take mom to the hospital. Oh, take mom to the hospital. But if I take the car at 3 o'clock to take my friend to the laundromat, the car will not be there at 3:15 for him to take his mother to the hospital. Won't be there. What should I do? Here are the thoughts that go through my mind. One is, well, it's too bad, but I made a promise. I promised this fellow I would help him with his laundry. My friend will come home, the car won't be there. It's nobody's fault. Nobody's guilty here. I made my promise, he made his promise. So, he won't be able to fulfill his promise. Of course, he's not guilty, it wasn't irresponsible of him, he didn't do anything wrong. It just turned out that he can't do it. Imagine the car had flat tires. He also wouldn't be able to do it. Right? That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is, but I'm making my decision. I want to do the right thing. Shouldn't the fact that his promise is a much more serious promise, a much more important promise, shouldn't that be part of my calculation as to what I do? Since when I keep my promise, it comes out that he won't be able to keep his promise. And if you ask me, why do I think my promise is more important, his promise is more important than mine? I have a suggestion. Here's how you can test which promise is more important. Let's suppose that I had made both promises myself, because I forgot. I promised my friend that I would take her to the laundromat. I promised my mother I would take her to the hospital. And I forgot in between. And then at 2:45, I say, I'm in trouble, because I made two promises and I can't keep both. If I have to decide which of my promises I should keep, the promise to take my friend to the laundromat or the promise to take my mother to the hospital, it seems obvious that I ought to choose to take my mother to the hospital. So that means that in some absolute sense, some objective sense, a promise to take your mother to the hospital is more important than a promise to help someone go to the laundromat. But here it's not both my promises. It's mine and my roommate's. So what should I do? Should I take the car and leave a note for my roommate and say, so sorry, but I made a promise for 3 o'clock? Or should I not take the car and let him use it and break my promise to the fellow that I made the promise to?
Depends on alternative options.
What's that, sorry?
It depends on alternative options. Can you borrow someone else's car?
Obviously not, otherwise I wouldn't ask the question, right? And maybe I can arrange the trip to the hospital to be on another day, or maybe I could win the lottery and have a bus pick her up and so forth and so on, right? If I ask the question, I mean that between these two alternatives, what should I choose? The point of asking the question is not to stimulate your imagination to figure out how you could solve both problems by inventing E.T., a visit by E.T. The point of it is to say, if these are the two options, which option is stronger and why? What are we saying about how morality works and how responsibilities work by choosing one over the other?
One thing is you have additional information about your friend and his mom's condition, and one thing you could say is that if it's an emergency, you certainly don't plan it in advance. So the fact that it's planned out means it's probably not an emergency.
Right.
But you don't know anything else other than that. But if it was an emergency, it's something that it's not going to be planned like that, right?
Agreed. Right. It's not an emergency.
Could be, because she could be scheduled to have surgery or something, and he's going to drive her over. So you can't have a guarantee it's not urgent.
So it could be, but let's leave that part of it out. I agree with you. Urgency could decide the outcome in a way that would be objectively correct, but I don't want to push that button. That's not where I want to where I'd like to go. In other words, think of it as a favor that I'm doing for my friend to go to the laundromat, and a favor that he's doing to take his mother to the hospital.
Is it possible to wait 15 minutes because or I guess you'd have, it's 2:45 you said.
Yeah. So I've got to leave at 3 o'clock to get. If I'm going to keep my promise to my friend, I have to leave at 3 o'clock. He's not going to come home till 3:15.
If you feel his is more important, is it possible to just wait until your friend gets back home?
Obviously not. That's
Okay.
not. I'm not talking now about falling asleep and or taking drugs or cloning myself and I'll be in two places at once. That's not the point of the question. The point of the question is these options use general principles to decide which of these two options that I have, should be made. What do you say?
Seems similar to the trolley question.
I'm sorry. Say it again.
It seems similar to the trolley problem where you have to choose. So here, if you choose to help your friend, the consequence is, but that's an indirect consequence, not really me. Whereas if I choose to ditch my friend so that now I'm actively doing something bad to.
I think it's different from the trolley problem. I think it's different in a deep way. I think it's different in a superficial way. The lesson of the trolley problem is that consequences aren't the only consideration. The trolley problem is built around two cases where the consequences are exactly the same. Either one person dies or five people die. And your intuition is that in the one case, you should change the circumstances so that only one person dies. And the other case, you should not change the circumstances so that only one person dies. And the lesson is, well, then how many people die isn't what determines the outcome. Not alone, anyway. There are other factors which also are relevant to determining the outcome. It's against utilitarianism and in favor of deontology. That's the point of the trolley argument. Here, I think you can phrase this question in either way, either in terms of consequences or in terms of responsibilities. What will be the consequence of my keeping my appointment and keeping my promise? Well, a fellow who otherwise will have to struggle to get to the laundromat won't get to the laundromat. He'll have to struggle. Right? What will be the consequence of my roommates not taking his mother to the hospital? Consequence will be that she won't have her son with her when she goes to the hospital. So I think in terms of consequences, it's clear that his failure is a much worse failure than my failure will be. That's one. And then if you back it up and talk about not the consequences but the obligation, when we talk about the seriousness of a promise, part of the way that we ask about it is, well, what are the circumstances of the promise? This is a promise to a friend, and that's a promise to a mother. A promise to a mother intuitively carries more weight than a promise to a friend because you have a special relationship with your mother. So either way, I think you can argue that his promise is a more serious moral, has more serious moral content than mine does. Whether you look at the obligations or whether you look at the consequences, it's equal in both cases. So the trolley problem is not going to help us here. This kind of formal structure, but when you take apart the innards of it, it's not going to help us to decide what to do here. Well, let me try to sharpen the question a little bit. Let's hear reasons why I should keep my promise. I'm sorry?
Take the friends to the laundromat?
Yeah. And leave my roommate without the car. Oh, okay. Let's see. If everybody's agreed that we shouldn't, that's an interesting outcome already.
I would say probably one of the supporting reasons for it is that people should be people of their word, keep their word.
Yeah. Thank you for the water. So I made a promise. So now somehow, if I'm going to leave the car for my friend, I'm breaking my promise to this fellow. Where do we have the moral leverage to say, yeah, you should break your promise? Ordinarily, breaking your promise is a bad thing to do. Yeah, if you could save someone's life by breaking your promise, maybe you should, but where's the moral leverage here? Yeah.
And the basis of human relationship. You keep someone else's promises that you gave, that you expect someone will keep promises that they gave you. It's like the basis of the society.
Okay, so that's okay. So in other words, breaking promises. Okay, let's follow that out. Breaking promises is a large part of having a cooperative society. If you can't trust people's promises, you can't predict the future. He said he'll do it, but who knows if he will? You can't have solidarity and partnerships. It's going to be a very difficult thing. Now, let's just follow out his idea. If I keep my promise, my roommate isn't breaking his promise. It's like finding 4 flats in the car. He just can't do it. So if I keep my promise, there are no promises broken. And if keeping promises is an important moral consideration, then that's a reason why I should keep my promise. That's one way to look at it. Yeah.
If he can't do it, he's still breaking his promise.
No, he's not breaking his promise. He isn't fulfilling his promise. There's a difference between not fulfilling a promise and breaking a promise. Breaking a promise means you choose not to do it. Here, it's impossible to do. And the difference is a moral judgment, right? I wouldn't condemn him if he had 4 flats. But I would condemn him if he said, I'm playing video games, forget my mother. Right? Then I would definitely condemn him. So that's called breaking a promise. It's not called breaking a promise.
Well, maybe he isn't breaking the promise, but his reliability is going down just because something happened. Like the more stuff pops up and the guy can't follow through, even if it's a reason that's out of his control, the more the reliability goes down anyways.
Well, I don't know. You're speaking like an insurance. The insurance people do say, if you've had 3 accidents and all 3 are not your fault, we're raising your premium, because you attract accidents. you're an accident attractor. You know, I don't know how reasonable that is, and I don't know what the certification for it is, but okay. Let's try to take his thought and twist it around. How serious will it be if people break a promise because they're facilitating somebody else to fulfill his more important promise? Is that going to create distrust and lack of reliability in other people? I can't really trust them. Or going to say, well, he made a moral calculation. The moral calculation is a reasonable calculation. I trust people to do things which are morally reasonable. And he's doing things morally reasonable in breaking the promise. Breaking the promise was morally reasonable, in which case it wouldn't reduce trust of people in society. It's too formal a picture of just breaking the promise. Let me see if I can explain to you where I'm coming from. The whole problem exists because I and my roommate are 2 different people. I already said, how could you judge that the one promise is more important than the other? If both promises were my promises, it would be clear what I have to do. But it isn't both mine. One's mine and one's his. Maybe the fact that it's his doesn't count. Maybe one of my responsibilities in the world is to consider other people's responsibilities. Maybe part of my responsibility in the world is to act in such a way that the world as a whole will be as morally ideal as possible. So now I look at myself as I'm deciding between two outcomes. One outcome is I drive my friend to his laundromat, and the other outcome is my roommate drives his mother to the hospital. I'm in charge. I determine which one will take place. And then someone will say, well, okay, so what if it's his responsibility? You're determining which promise shall be fulfilled. And you yourself just agreed that the promise to take your mother to the hospital is a more important promise than the promise to take someone to the laundromat. So then the fact that it's another person doesn't matter. It's not part of the calculation that you should take into account. And therefore I should break my promise. I would say to the other guy, listen, I know I promised you, and I'm sorry to tell you that I made a mistake. I wasn't guilty either because of the way we used the car. Neither of us was guilty. It turns out there's a conflict, and the conflict is with something much more important. And I hope you will realize, I would say to my friend, that if you were in the same circumstances, you would do the same thing that I'm doing. You would opt to determine the more important outcome, the more valuable, more pressing outcome. What this does is it introduces a social element into morality. That my moral responsibilities are dependent upon my relationships to other people and what their moral responsibilities are. And from a certain Western perspective, this is utterly unnatural, utterly unexpected. There's a kind of individualism built into the Western social ethic, and I think it's grossly deficient. But here's a case where I think your intuitions, if your intuition agrees with me, your intuition can see that thinking of my life, my responsibilities, my moral record as my only moral focus is incorrect. Doesn't agree with the kinds of decisions that we think are correct decisions. Yeah.
I was just going to maybe kind of comment that I know that we're supposed to isolate the problem. Obviously, you guys would have coordinated this at the beginning of the day or something, and that didn't happen in order to facilitate the problem, right? Because
I said it was 20 years ago. There are no cell phones.
Yeah,
we have irregular schedules. We can't be in touch with one another. I tried to take care of that.
Right. So I was just going to say maybe that also helps you decide on not taking the car in that situation, because in a way, when you made the promise to the friend, I mean, it's true also, though, when the friend made the promise to his mom, that it's sort of a conditional promise, which means it's conditional that the car will be available and functioning correctly when I encounter it, which that wasn't a guarantee. And it's not just like finding 4 flats. There's a much higher probability than 4 flat tires that you will not find the car because the roommate's using it. And so because there's a non-trivial probability that the car won't be there, in a way, the promise was never really like 100%. In other words, there's a non-trivial amount of doubt when you make the promise in the first place. I don't know.
Okay, I hear that. I think that's a correct observation. But in this case, since I have it in my power to make the car available, it's not going to be accidentally missing because I saw his date book and I saw what he has to do. So that's not going to help excuse the outcome here, because I'm determining whether he has the car or not. So I'm trying to figure out what to do. Yeah.
Wouldn't this change if we knew that the person that wanted his laundry done wouldn't care about the mother going to the hospital? He would want to get his laundry done if you would ask him?
In other words, he would say, I want you to come to pick me up anyway?
Yeah.
Right. I think we should assume that and say, even so.
Even so.
If you know for sure that he would congratulate you and say, of course you did the right thing, that makes it much easier to decide that I should leave the car for my roommate. Now, let's say he would say, you promised me I want to see you here. Right? And then I would have to simply say, you're demanding something which should be overcome by a stronger moral requirement. And if you don't recognize that, I'm sorry for you, but I have to act on what I regard as the stronger moral requirement. Let's move to another problem, which will probably sound like it's in another world, but I think you'll see that it has a very strong connection with this problem. And then I'll try to draw out some general consequences. Let's say I've borrowed money, and there's a due date. What is my responsibility? is my responsibility to pay the money back? Or is my responsibility to do my best to pay the money back? What is my obligation on the basis of the fact that I have borrowed money?
Do your best.
You have to pay it back, and because you have to pay it back, do your best to make sure it gets paid back.
So the two of you disagree. That's nice. That's good. He's saying that the obligation is to do your best. You're saying the obligation is to pay it back, and because the obligation is to pay it back, there's a consequent obligation to do your best to pay it back. Okay, now how could we determine this? What kind of reasons could we give one way or the other? Yeah.
I could say with the ability to do anything, like I might be free of my obligation if I say I will pay you off for my salary or whatever it is, and then I don't know, or a person just dies, get paralyzed and so on. It's obvious like he has no any more responsibility to pay that.
Let me try to explain your intuition in slightly different words, which might help other people see it. I think you're expressing a very important intuition. Suppose somebody tells me, listen, you really ought to do X. And I say, you don't know my circumstances, but let me explain to you why I can't do X. Should he withdraw his judgment? I said, you can't tell me to do what I can't do. What's the point of that? What's the point of asking me to recognize an obligation which is impossible for me to fulfill? The very fact that I'm unable to fulfill it means I'm not obligated in the first place to do it. Let's think about failure. Suppose someone fails. As you'll see, this move is not a legitimate move, but it's one move. The move is made in this context. Let's suppose there's a failure. I had an obligation, and I failed to fulfill it. Somebody says to me, "Why did you do that? You just ignored what you had to do." I said, "No, I didn't ignore it. Look, I couldn't have done it." Won't he withdraw his condemnation? Won't he withdraw his critique? Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that that's the circumstances you were in. And, you should have come to the meeting. We were counting on you to come. You said you would come to the meeting. Yeah, but I was in an automobile accident and I broke my back. And I was in the hospital. And so, you say, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that. And now knowing that, I'll withdraw my critique. What's the matter with you? Why didn't you come to the meeting? I withdraw the critique because the critique is irrelevant now that I know that you couldn't have come to the meeting. This is the intuition, is his intuition, as against your intuition. And his intuition is shared by one of the greatest of the modern philosophers, Immanuel Kant, who said, ought implies can. To say that you ought to do something implies that you're able to do it. Otherwise, you withdraw the ought. And this is the kind of intuition that people feel that gives them some reason to agree with Kant. Because to say that you ought when a person cannot do it, it's like saying to someone, you ought to jump 10 feet in the air. Wouldn't he say, what are you talking about? For me, 3 feet is a big job. 10 feet in the air, forget it. Right? Yeah.
So you started off this example by using monetary transaction, and then went on to explain his I don't know who said it, Israel, with the point of view like, oh, somebody couldn't show up to the meeting. You had to show up to the meeting, but they couldn't show up to the meeting because they broke their back. And at least in my own thinking, that those are almost completely different. Even though I see the philosophical relation between the two, that when in hindsight it's easy. It's not in hindsight, but you were supposed to be at a meeting and then the guy told you he broke his back, so he couldn't do it. That seems a little different to me than when you take a loan and you have to be paying back the loan, or there's a due date on your loan, and then at the end of the collection date you say, oh well, I lost my job, and it's actually in my mind it's very different. I think I share the opinion of.
Would you say there's a different outcome in the two cases? That in the one case where he can't do it, he still does have the obligation. In the other case where he can't do it, the obligation disappears. Is the difference one that's going to change outcome to the question that I'm asking?
Well, I would say it'd be harder, personally, it would be harder for me to withdraw my condemnation
Mhm.
for at least in the monetary example than the meeting example.
Really? Let's make it concrete. You know, he borrowed the money, he had collateral, and his house was collateral on the money, he has a job, he's earning, he's got a bank account, you know, he just needs a lot of cash at the moment, but in all expectation, he's going to be able to pay it back. And then, as you say, he loses his job, the house burns down, or let's say it's destroyed in a hurricane, and he doesn't have hurricane insurance, and he's really penniless. He's really penniless. So the bank says, hand over the cash. And I says, what cash? I haven't got any cash. I just don't have. That's not my fault. None of these things were my irresponsibility or carelessness. These were things which I couldn't have prevented, I couldn't have foreseen, and I just don't have the cash. Is that really different from not attending the meeting with a broken back?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think the prerequisite of taking out a loan is accepting the risk that you won't be able to pay it back. The prerequisite of taking out a loan is I will have to pay it back no matter what. And the risk that you won't be able to do that has to be included.
You mean from the point of view of the bank?
Yeah.
Well, of course, they do know some loans don't get paid back. And not always because people cheat. Someday they realize that circumstances do arise where people can't pay back loans. That's true.
Well, the person agreed to take the risk that he wouldn't be able to pay it back, even if something extreme would have happened. He has to take that risk when he takes the loan.
I mean, he's not taking the risk. The bank is taking the
He's
risk,
also
right?
taking the risk that he won't be able to pay it back.
You mean the moral risk? I'm not quite sure. He's not giving money. What's the risk? A risk usually means risk means that something bad will happen. What bad is happening here? He's not paying back the loan. Okay, I don't mind. If he's a morally scrupulous person, then he understands that there's a risk. He will not be able to fulfill that obligation that he contracted. Okay, fine. But what I'm asking is, from Kant's point of view, do we say, no, you still ought to pay it back when you have no money?
Well, I think the bank, at least, it's easy to use the bank because these are examples that happen in life that we know what would happen.
That's right.
That a bank would not say, oh, it's okay that you have no money. They're gonna go to collect a debt and you're either gonna go bankrupt or have to declare bankruptcy.
But suppose he's already bankrupt. Suppose there's nothing to collect it from.
It's true.
Okay, so now, yeah.
I think there's like a problem intrinsically in between the questions, because in between the promises, because on the promise of paying back a loan and the promise on going to a meeting, the meeting, like once you didn't go there, there's nothing you can do besides like forgive, because the meeting's done.
Yeah.
But a loan you could keep chasing, so like you don't have to give up on the loan just because they're broke right now.
You don't have to give up on it. That's true. The question is whether you ought to give up on it. According to Kant, saying that someone ought to do something when he's incapable of doing it is vacuous.
Yeah,
It's-
but situations change. Like you work on it, you work on your finances, you get a new job, you slowly pay it back, even if the loan takes years and years to pay.
Okay. I'm going to go in that direction to a certain extent. Let's try this. Kant didn't get away free with his idea. Some people want to say that we could disagree with Kant and still save some of our intuition here. I said before that I made a move that I'm going to take back later, and here's where we're going to take it back. When a person is incapable of doing something, you might say, can't have an obligation, that's what Kant says. You might say, he does have an obligation, but he doesn't deserve any penalty for failure to live up to the obligation. Using your vocabulary, he didn't pay the money. We're not going to condemn him for not paying the money. We're not going to criticize him. We're not going to penalize him. In an older form of law, they used to call these acts of God. Things that are impossible to anticipate and impossible to control.
Force majeure.
Sorry?
Force majeure.
Force majeure? I'm not sure that's it. Okay. But that would be a reason not to condemn him for failure. It wouldn't be a reason to erase the obligation. The picture now would be, yes, he still is obligated. It's just that for this kind of failure, there's no penalty. I think the Torah takes the second view. And here's a nafkamina. What a nafkamina means, some practical difference between the two views, which makes the difference in what you should do. There he is, the day he paid the debt, and his house burned down, and he lost his job, and he hasn't got a cent to his name. But I could lend him the money. I could. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know that I have the money. He doesn't know that I'm interested in him, but I could do it. Is there any reason for me to lend him the money to pay the loan? According to Kant, the picture is, what loan? What are you talking about? He has no obligations. Because he can't pay, he's not obligated to pay. The world is morally perfect. Nothing's wrong. Nothing's outstanding. Nothing's unfulfilled because he has no obligation. If, on the other hand, you say he has an obligation, he just doesn't deserve any penalty for failing to fulfill it, then the world has in it an unfulfilled moral obligation. And by my lending him the money, he could fulfill that obligation. Then morally, the world is a better place. Because now something moral that's undone becomes done. So if you take the second view, that the consequences of inability are only to protect you against penalty, criticism, condemnation, but not to remove the obligation, then you import now again a social feature of morality. The nafkamina will be that, socially speaking, I have a moral reason to lend him the money so that he can fulfill his obligation. That's the connection with the first case, the idea of a social aspect of morality. As I said, I think we definitely have this position. There is a responsibility if someone needs to do a mitzvah and he hasn't got the ability to do the mitzvah, and I can provide it for him, then it is a mitzvah for me to provide it for him, and whether it's an obligation or not depends on my other obligations, but it was definitely a mitzvah for me to do it. So on Sukkot, when you're supposed to perform a certain waving ceremony with a lulav and an esrog, 4 species of plants, that's quite expensive, and sometimes they're rare. The market is rare, and I have a quadruple, and Ruvain doesn't. It's definitely something for me to do to enable him to use mine. I know the difference the first day and the other days. That's why I said enable. I enable him to use mine so that he can fulfill the obligation. We don't say, well, he hasn't got, so he can't do it, so there's no obligation. No, he hasn't got, and there is an obligation. He hasn't got, so therefore he's not going to be criticized or penalized for not doing it. But if I give it to him, then he's fulfilling the obligation that he has to do it. So we definitely take that social view of responsibilities for other people. This is a crucial deep Jewish concept. So we're together so far? So now you see when Aristotle said that man is by nature social, and in the modern world, from the British political thinkers to the American political thinkers, each person is an individual, each person has his own life. Society has to be constructed artificially. It's unnatural for a human being to have responsibilities in terms of other people. There has to be a compact, a kind of agreement that people make to take joint responsibility for the circumstances under which they live. It requires an agreement. Without an agreement, agreements are free. You could not make it. So then people object, but nobody really made an agreement. Come on, there never was a vote on this. People are just living together. There's an implicit agreement. Because when people do things, you want the consequences to be structured so that you don't get hurt. Well, if that's the case, then you have to participate in the same responsibility that you want other people to have. So it's an implicit agreement, an implicit compact in the way. But the whole need for it is that nature is isolation and individualism, and the structure of the society has to be built by some kind of action or implied action of bringing people together. From Aristotle's point of view, the whole thing's backwards. You don't have a human being if you don't have a society. It's not human. And here, I think what we're seeing is that it has nothing to do here with our jointly contributing to the defense of the country, or building a dam to hold back the water, or using division of labor to improve the economy. This could be a single case, like the case of the car. It's just a single case. That's all. What should you do? What shouldn't you do? That means that the mitzvos that are given to us have a built-in social character. Here's what the Gemara says about a case which actually happens from time to time, and where you can see it working. Once a week, we have a mitzvah of making Kiddush Friday night. Making Kiddush is reciting a certain paragraph for 40 seconds. Every Jew has an obligation to make Kiddush. What usually happens is there's a Friday night meal, and there's a host, and there are guests, and the host makes the Kiddush. He says the words, holding the cup of wine, and everybody else satisfies his obligation by listening to him. That's a feature of commandments of speech. If there's a commandment of speech where, strictly speaking, everyone's supposed to speak for himself, you can fulfill that commandment by listening to somebody else speak. He has in mind that his speech should work for you. You have in mind that his speech should work for you. It's as if you said it. Shomei ka'ona. So listening under those conditions is as if you said the speech and you satisfy your obligation. Okay, so here it is Friday night, and we're at the table, and I make Kiddush. We all wash, we make hamotzi, we're eating the meal. Knock on the door. Hello. A stranger standing there, and he says, Rabbi, I didn't do the mitzvah of Kiddush tonight. Could you please make Kiddush for me? Could I please make Kiddush for him? Well, my natural thought is, I can't do that because I made Kiddush already. What, say the paragraph over again? That'll just be reading Hebrew words. That's not doing the mitzvah of Kiddush. It's a once-a-week mitzvah. I did it already. Come back next Friday. No, he wants help now. He wants help now. So what should I do? So the Gemara says you can. And Rashi says the reason is because we're all responsible for one another. We're all responsible for one another. When I first read that, I said, okay, I'm responsible for him. I should help him. I shouldn't ignore him. I'll give him his own cup of wine. I'll give him his own siddur to say the words from. He can't read. I'll say the words, and he can say them after me, and he can do it. I'm not ignoring him. I'm not abandoning him, but I have a legal problem. I can't make Kiddush for him again, because you don't make Kiddush twice Friday night. You only make Kiddush once Friday night. Now, I didn't understand how Rashi's reasoning enables you to get to the conclusion that you can make Kiddush again. Well, the Ran says it word for word. The Ran says, as long as there's any Jew in the world who hasn't made Kiddush, my obligation of Kiddush is not exhausted. Because my obligation of Kiddush is inherently social. My obligation is this. There's a mitzvah for Jews to make Kiddush, and my obligation is to do whatever I can to enable the collectivity to fulfill the obligation. Which means when he walks in the door, my own personal mitzvah of Kiddush is revived. And it is possible to make Kiddush more than once on Friday night. You know, in Europe, when it came to the night of the Seder is a very complex performance, and there were widows. And some of them widows with no children or with very small children who couldn't help her. The rabbi of the city would go from house to house making the Seder for each widow before he would come home and make a Seder for his own family. And he said all the blessings over and over and over again. Because the mitzvah of Kiddush is inherently a social mitzvah. This is characteristic of many mitzvahs. There are always exceptions, but it's characteristic of many mitzvahs. The very definition of the mitzvah is social in that way. Yeah.
You said the mitzvah of Kiddush is not completely fulfilled until every single Jew hears it. Kiddush for as many Jews as I can.
That is an obligation. You have lots of obligations, and the obligations very often conflict with one another. And what you should do in a practical sense depends upon what your other conflicting obligations are. But I gave you an example where it would definitely apply. So I don't have to go around to Ben Yehuda Street and ask, did you hear Kiddush yet? And try to get them to listen. I don't have to do that. But if somebody knocks on my door and says, I want you to make Kiddush for me, I can do that, because the fact that he hasn't made it means that my mitzvah of Kiddush is still alive, and therefore I'm making Kiddush the second time, and then he can satisfy his obligation by listening to me make Kiddush the second time.
So why is it not my obligation to go knock on my neighbor's door?
I didn't say it wasn't your obligation. I said it was your obligation. Listen again. I said it is an obligation, but you have many obligations. And the obligations usually conflict. And what you do has to be decided on the basis of which obligations are more important and how you can maximize your fulfillment of all the obligations that you have. I said that you do have an obligation, but going from I have an obligation to this is what I need to do is a step that requires reasoning. It's not an automatic step. Very often you have obligations that conflict with one another. I'm sitting at my Friday night table. I have a family that depends upon me. I have children whose learning has to be reviewed. I have inspiration to give and answers to give to guests that I've invited. Those are also obligations. So it's not that there isn't obligations, it's what to do. Some people use the terminology of prima facie obligation. It means other things being equal and other things not to be taken into account, I have an obligation, which leaves room for saying I have an obligation, but I'm not going to do it because I have other obligations that take precedence. Other people don't like that terminology, but that's one way that people talk about it. Okay, now if you look at the mitzvahs that we have, you'll see now with this aspect in your mind, a social dimension expressing itself in many, many cases, in many different ways. You probably know that there is a mitzvah to pray together with a minyan. 10 men together. What difference does it make? After all, when you pray together with another 9 people, each one of you says the words on your own. It's just that 9 other people are in the room. So what difference does it make that there are 9 other people in the room? So the idea of a minyan, which applies in many other cases aside from just praying together, the idea of a minyan is learned. I heard this from Rabbi Yeshivat Ohr Somayach in Boston about 50 years ago. It is derived from the spies that were sent to the land of Israel to spy it out, and 10 came back with an evil report, and God punished them by ending their lives. And they're called an Eidah. Eidah means like some kind of congregation. And then it says, God's name should be sanctified, and the word there that's used is Eidah. There's an Eidah in between, it's a double Geder Shav for those who know. So the 10 that are there for the minyan, that 10 is learned from the 10 spies. Now Rabbi Soloveitchik asked the following question: what is a spy? What does a spy do? Well, often he records information that's against the law in the country that he's visiting. Don't take pictures here. Don't record these voices and so forth and so on. He's broken the law, no question about it. But it's not like breaking a speeding law, not even like stealing. What's the difference? If you spy in another country, that's an action of one country to another country. If he's caught, the second nation would be justified in withdrawing its ambassador or shooting a missile. What do you mean? You sent spies into my country to steal my secrets? That's a national action, not an individual action. The spies are doing something on behalf of their country. They represent their country in the action. And that determines how the consequences are allotted. So he said, since the Gemara learns the 10 for the minyan from the 10 spies, one thing it implies is that the minyan functions as a representation of the Jewish people. It isn't just 10 Jews getting together to pray together. It's an ambassadorial group. Now, when you pray, and you, so to speak, knock on the door to the throne room, and the attending angel says, "Yes, who are you? Why should I let you in?" And you say, "I'm Reuven Schwartz," and say, "Come back next month." But if there are 10 of you, and you say, "We are an ambassadorial group representing the nation of Israel," the door opens. Instantly. Kodesh Baruch Hu has a commitment to the Jewish people as a whole that he doesn't have to each and every individual Jew. So when the 10 represent the nation, their prayer is an entirely different activity. It's a national action rather than an individual action. Even though each one is praying by himself, but when you have 10 praying together, that makes it into a national action. Well, if you have the opportunity to do that, you certainly should take it. That's why, one of the reasons why it's an obligation to pray with a minyan when you can pray with a minyan, because there's a collective identity to the prayer that it has when it's 10 people together, rather than when it isn't. So that's another example of where the social aspect plays a role. Yeah.
The question is then, we can say if there is, as long as there is like 10 people who are praying together, that's a national election. The rest of the nation don't need to pray because it's 10 people already represent the nation itself. On that part.
Let me give you a parallel. I use this parallel to illustrate the idea, and maybe I'll just do it, and then I'll answer your question. You have the British ambassador to the United States, and you have the American Secretary of State. I imagine the British ambassador calls up the American Secretary of State and says, "Are you free on Saturday? Let's play tennis." And he says, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm busy on Saturday." He says, "Okay, I'll call you next week." Contrast that where the British ambassador calls the American Secretary of State and says, "I have a notice to deliver to you from London." And the American Secretary of State says, "I'm busy, call me back next week." There's a big difference in the two refusals, isn't there? Because in the second case, he's refusing the communication from the government of Great Britain. In the first case, he just doesn't want to play tennis. So it means the ambassador of Britain can play two different roles. He's a person who likes to play tennis, and he's also an ambassador. And his actions are different in that way. So here we're functioning as ambassadors. Now, let's suppose instead of the ambassador calling up, suppose that the ambassador and the prime minister and the king of England, all three call up. And all three say, "We want to meet with the Secretary of State." Wouldn't that make a difference than just one of them calling up? Wouldn't it be a much bigger insult to say no to all three of them than to say no to one of them? So the fact that you have a representative of the country doesn't mean that 2 and 3 representatives don't have more weight. They certainly do. And if the Jewish people as a whole, without other representatives acting on their behalf, but the Jewish people as a whole corroborates in the effort, then of course it's going to be much more important than just the representatives doing it. And let me just point out that this is part of the understanding of the way prayer works. The prayers, you may realize, are constructed in such a way as to parallel the sacrifices. There are 2 daily prayers and the evening prayer also, which is somehow, in a certain sense, less important, because there were 2 daily sacrifices. In the evening, nighttime, they burned up what was remains of the sacrifices. On Shabbos, there's an extra prayer because an extra sacrifice. The times of the prayers match the times of the sacrifices. There's a strict correspondence between them. Why is that? The Gemara says, "Tfilos keneged korbanos tiknum." The prayers were instituted to be parallel to the sacrifices, not in place of the missing sacrifices. That's a historical mistake and a philosophical mistake. It should be in parallel. Why should it be in parallel? Well, first of all, because prayer and sacrifices are linked together by verses in the Hebrew Bible long before it was created by the rabbis. They didn't invent this. There's a verse in Isaiah which says, I will bring them to my holy mountain, to my house of prayer, where their sacrifices will be accepted by me on the altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. You read that, it's house of prayer at the beginning, house of prayer at the end, and in the middle, sacrifices. Well, that means the place where you offer sacrifice is called house of prayer. It's never called house of sacrifices, never. It's called house of prayer in that verse. And Solomon, when he built the temple, and he gave an inaugurational speech, and he expresses what the house is for, the only activity he mentions for the temple is prayer. If you would have his inauguration, you wouldn't even know there were sacrifices there at all. So prayer and sacrifices are definitely linked biblically. Up until what the rabbis did at the beginning of the Second Temple, a Jew could say, am I represented in the sacrifices? Sure, because once a year I pay my dues, you see. In Adar, I paid my half shekel. On time, I pay it. So that in July 16th, when I sleep till noon, when they offered the sacrifice at 8 in the morning, I was there, my name was on it, because I paid my dues. Well, the rabbis at the beginning of the Second Temple said that's not good enough. Just having the priests represent you isn't good enough. We want a national institution of national sacrifice with national participation. And if you understand prayer as sacrifice, which I haven't got time to explain now, but it's in my first book, The Informed Soul, which is upstairs. If you understand prayer as a kind of sacrifice, then it is a national participation in that sacrifice. The priests perform the sacrifices in the temple, and the rest of the nation prays, and they are joined together. That's why the prayers are made to correspond to the sacrifices, because together they should do something which doesn't rely on the representatives in the temple who are representing us before God. It shouldn't rely on that. It can, it's possible, did so for 1,000 years, but it's better when it isn't that way. So that's why it's not a question of just, if you've got one ambassadorial group, then the rest of the people don't have to pray. Yeah.
The question is, okay, some people not righteous. And for example, if we continue with your metaphor about the important people, you mentioned king, ambassador, I don't know, secretary, and so on. What do we say? And 5,000 criminals also going to be at that meeting. Like, it will lower the level of the meeting itself. And maybe
No,
someone would say, maybe don't bring.
No, we don't look at it that way. First of all, let's say when two countries negotiate a treaty, it applies to everybody, even the mafia. It applies to them. The law is there. They can be prosecuted on the basis of the law. And the fact that they're criminals doesn't mean that the law doesn't apply to them. It does apply to them. And you take it into account. Listen, the criminals are there, and the law is going to be like this, and the law enforcement will have to worry about it. You take that all into account, number one. But the Gemara says something else. It says the opposite of what you're saying. It says a Tanis, which is a fast day, which is for the sake of overcoming, usually, some kind of problem by identifying our failures and trying to overcome them. A fast day that doesn't have wicked people there won't be successful. Called Tanis Shemba Poshea won't be successful. So you have to engage them as well. No, we don't feel that it lowers. And the symbol of it is this: the 4 species that you use on Sukkot, one species produces a fruit that has both a good taste and a nice aroma. Another produces one with only a good taste. Another produces one with only a good aroma. Not a fruit, the leaves themselves have a good aroma. And the 4th one has no taste and no aroma. And all 4 have to be there. Even the one with no taste and no aroma. So again, this is a representation of the community as a whole. Yom Kippur, the night of Yom Kippur, starts with the words, Anu matirin v'hispalel im ha'avaryonim. we permit the prayers together with those who are criminals. So, it's much more subtle than what you say. Okay, this I think is a very important idea. It has many, many, many applications. The social nature of the Torah's philosophy, and the social nature of the human being, which we could expand on, and maybe we will on another occasion. Okay.